Before we finish out microevolution, we have to talk about the actual 3 modes of natural selection. Okay, so natural selection, remember, is environmental factors regulating the rate at which an allele frequency is present in a population. Okay, fine. So when we look at these modes of natural selection, this is actually a very simple concept. So don't make it more complicated than it is, okay? We've talked polygenic before. What does polygenic mean? Poly is many. So we're looking at many genes influencing one trait. So in this case, looking at many genes influencing a couple of different traits in this case, but they're all going to show one of these patterns. So we're going to see something called stabilizing selection. So basically everybody becomes average. Directional selection, we're either going to go one way or the other. Everybody's either going to become really big or really small. And then disruptive selection, we actually are going to split it down the middle. So some of you may think about this as a bimodal distribution, right? So we have the 2 extremes that we're going to keep, but we get rid of everybody who's average. We'll see where that happens. In stabilizing selection, as we said, everybody becomes average. Well, why would that happen? Well, let's look at infant birth rates in the human population. Infant birth rate sits around about 6.5 pounds on average. Individuals that are born larger than that, so over 10 pounds, and smaller than that, under 4 pounds, we look at percent of infant death rates going way up for those individuals, right? This red curve is actually percent of births, okay? And percent of infant deaths is in the blue. So this is death. Okay, so when we look at percent of infant death in our blue here, we see about a 5% mortality in large babies, about a 72%, 75% mortality in tiny babies. But then with our infants in the middle here, we got a decent amount of them that are doing really, really well, right? So when we look at birth weight in pounds, falling into that average kind of area means that you're in good shape for survival. Directional selection, on the other hand, means that one way is favored or another. Now, it's showing you in this case kind of an increase, but a decrease could also be favored. So in directional selection, in this case, they were looking at the changes in a fossil record, so how these shells changed over time. And what they found was they actually started to shift away from this idea of being very, very rough to being very, very smooth. So as the newer fossils were found, why would you make that shift from one extreme to another? Well, it could be environment, right? Resource availability, okay? Or potentially just the individual, it's going to cost energy, right, to make ridges. Well, if you don't need the ridges for anything, why make them, right? Why make something you don't need? So now, because these are fossil shells, we don't know why they may have shifted in this direction, but we certainly see it. Disruptive selection, on the other hand, essentially favors both extremes and says everybody in the middle is gone. Why? Well, let's go back to birds for just a second and look at beak size. So what they found is that in the African finches, we've actually started to favor a group that have relatively small beaks and a group that have larger beaks. Now, this larger beak group, I agree, is smaller, but you've gotten rid of everybody in the middle. Why would we do this? Well, as I have noted here for you, they found that the intermediate sized beaks are actually much less effective feeders. So these populations are likely eating two different things, but if you have an intermediate sized beak, it turns out that you're not very good at eating either one. So we've eliminated to a great extent that phenotype in the population. We can also look at changes in fur color. Okay, there are all kinds of options here. There are tons online if you want to look for other examples. But the idea is either you're picking the average, you're getting rid of the average, or you're shifting in one direction or the other from that average. So in a population, this can have really significant effects long term, because if you start to shift towards a particular phenotype, that phenotype, if it's favored, means that you're going to start selecting for those alleles that generate that phenotype, right? So in the long run, this can look at shifts in the allele frequency in a population. So microevolution is the change in our allele frequencies, right? So we mentioned that before. So microevolution gives you a shift or a change in the ratio of our alleles in a population, right? So how far does that shift actually have to go before we get a new species? That's our next discussion.